Welcome to Evergreen Spotlight, where we highlight one of our treasured podcasts on our constantly growing network. I'm Julie Holliday. I'm part of the marketing team here at Evergreen Podcasts. Our mission is to continually bring you content that is always relevant, content that is not limited by time. Today, the Evergreen Spotlight is on Cindy Burnett, host of Thoughts from a Page podcast, where she talks with guests about the books she loves and recommends. Cindy is an avid reader, blogger, and columnist. Let's check in with her and learn more about her podcast, Thoughts from a Page. Cindy, thank you so much for joining us for Evergreen Spotlight with your show, Thoughts from a Page, all about books. Where did your passion for books come from?
Well, I've always loved to read since I was young. And so I just continued to do that as I got older. I was a lawyer. After I retired from that, I just kept reading and eventually turned it into this. It's just such a great way to escape, I think.
I think so too. And you have like 260 some episodes your love came from probably whenever you were a child. What are some of the books that really first inspired you?
Well, I loved Charlotte's Web. I loved the Nancy Drew series. There are so many. I loved Agatha Christie when I was young, and I still do. So just a variety of books. I could go on and on and on.
Why do you think the correlation between readers and podcasters? We're sort of finding, and I'm finding in my own research, podcasters also love reading, and it doesn't always correlate. But why do you think that is?
Maybe that knowledge, wanting to learn. I think readers really want to learn, and I think the same thing with podcast listeners.
What are 3 books that you think every person should have in their book collection?
Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, the first is The Book Thief by Marcus Zusack. And I love that book. It's just beautiful. It's so well done. Talks a little bit about book burning and World War II. And it's narrated from the perspective of death, which is very interesting. It's just a beautiful story. I love A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles, one of my all-time favorite books. It's about a count who narrates what it's like once the Russian Revolution happens, what things are like in his world and how everything changes, but doesn't really change all that much in the end. And the third one, maybe A Man Called Ove by Fredrik Backman. It's about an older man who's really depressed and trying to work his way through what he's going to do and what's going to happen with his life, and then how his entire community changes his world. It's a beautiful story.
I really need to up my reading game. I don't think I've even heard of any of those books. Okay, let's talk about your show. For someone who's never heard of Thoughts from a Page, maybe you can let our listeners and readers know really what your show is about and how the process is for you and how it goes for you.
So the basis of my show is interviewing authors. So a couple times a week, I interview authors and I air those episodes. As the podcast has continued to grow and I've kind of thought about different things I'd like to do with it, I also do certain episodes where I talk about the books that are coming in the fall or the spring, or I talk about my favorite reads from a certain period of time. So it's just all about books. And if you love to read and want to learn more about authors or more about the whole process, I've got a whole series called Behind the Scenes. I interview people in the publishing world about all the behind the scenes, a cover designer, an interior designer, those type of things. And those episodes have been very popular.
I think of writing a book as such a mountain to climb. Is there something that you have found that is similar among these authors, or even, what it takes to write a book?
I think one of the things that almost every one of them says is you've got to get that initial words onto the page, that it's so difficult to sit there and look at a blank page. And so I think getting it down and then beginning to edit or thinking about the directions you want to go is the number one thing. But just to get started, and a routine. Everyone talks about a routine.
Actually making those, morning pages or, getting words onto the page. Now, that also translates to podcasting. How did that really get started for you in podcasting?
Well, I run a literary salon here in Houston where I bring in a couple of authors, maybe 8 times a year, and I interview them. And so people kept saying, you should turn this into a podcast. I will admit I'm not a huge podcast listener myself, which is kind of funny. And so I kept saying, well, I don't know what's involved. But I spent 2 months kind of researching, trying to figure out exactly what was involved, which was way more than I ever dreamed, and then just went from there. And it's been so much fun. Probably my favorite thing I've ever done.
What do you think, Cindy, is the hardest part about podcasting?
The time it takes. It's incredibly time consuming. And I don't think people understand that at all. I just recently saw a tweet from another podcaster where she had said she was taking a month-long break. And somebody responded, what do you need a break? It's just a podcast. It's not like writing a TV show or something like that. And I'm like, words of someone who has never produced a podcast.
You were talking before the interview, and you were saying that people send you the books and you read them. And so not even to mention that time that goes through, can you maybe talk about the process of really booking your interviews or how you go about finding the authors that you want to talk with?
Absolutely. So before I was a podcaster, I had this literary salon, but I also have an Instagram account that's very active. A bookstagram is what they call that whole world of books.
Oh, that's cute.
And then,
I like that.
Isn't that fun? I love that. And I'm on Twitter and I speak to groups and I do all sorts of stuff. So I already had all of this kind of built-in world of books. And I decided to launch the podcast. And I will tell you, the thing that was the most surprising to me was that was such a big step up in terms of publishers contacting me. People really want to be interviewed and have their book out there via podcast versus just Instagram or elsewhere. So what happens with me is I get pitched books. Okay, that book sounds good to me or it doesn't sound good to me. And then I request the book and I read it. And if I like it, then I ask to interview the author. I mean, they have pitched the author to me to be interviewed. And I say, let me read the book. And then if I do want to, I'll respond to you in interview. And then every once in a while I read a book I love and I just track down the publicist and say, I'd love to interview so-and-so. But the most way is I'm pitched and then I read the book and then I say, sure, I loved the book.
What a fun way to get connected with authors, to read a book and go, oh, I can possibly just reach out to them and talk with them. That's such a fun way to spin things,
That's the best part by far is interviewing the author and learning about their process. And I was a little nervous up front, talking to all these people I don't know. And I would say 99% of them are just delightful. It's just been so much fun. And I learned something every single time.
Cindy, what would you say was your favorite interview or interviews?
I think that's really hard to narrow down, but some of my favorite are Fiona Davis. She writes historical fiction around iconic New York City buildings. So she's always absolutely delightful to talk to. I also love Vanessa Riley. She has started writing historical fiction set usually in the Caribbean about Black women who are not known to history, telling their stories. And she is so much fun. But I could go on and on. I mean, like I said earlier, every interview is so much fun.
Now, what is your love for New York? Because I'm thinking that there's a little bit of a underlying. I was listening to your podcast, interviewing. What was the book that you were highlighting? The shoe one, and she was from New York.
A shoe story, yeah, she is.
Shoe story.
And I love that book. So I grew up here in Houston, but we lived in Connecticut when I was younger and went into the city a lot. And my mom and I love Broadway shows, so we would go to New York at least 2 or 3 times a year and see a bunch of shows. So I know the city really well. And then I now have a daughter who just finished her freshman year in college there. So I'm getting up there a lot. But it is one of my very favorite places in the world. I love Broadway shows. I love the city. So anytime there's a book set there, I almost always read it.
Awesome. I knew that there was a correlation.
Yeah.
Now, can you talk a little bit more, Cindy, now about the things that you do besides podcasting? I know that you write a few columns. You also contribute to a magazine. What are some other things that you have sort of irons in the fire?
Well, I write 2 different columns for a magazine here in Houston called The Buzz Magazines. I write a weekly online column where I do all sorts of fun things like just highlight books I've read, interview readers, interview authors, talk about indie bookstores, just whatever it is that's kind of book related that week. And then I write a monthly column that's in print and online where I highlight my favorite 5 books of the month. So that's for the Buzz Magazines. And then there's a big group online called She Reads, and I write all their historical fiction roundups. So yeah, which is so much fun.
Okay, Cindy, out of curiosity, who was your early inspiration or who continues to be your inspiration?
As I mentioned earlier, I'm not a huge podcast listener, but I do listen occasionally to Zibby Owens on Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. And she is just wonderful and has a similar platform. We read a lot of different books, so that's nice. I can listen to her interviews with other authors that I haven't read. And then Carol Ann Tack of Top Shelf at Merrick Library is one that I just adore. We do joint episodes together periodically, and I love her interview style. So those are the two that inspire me the most.
Where can people find you online?
Well, I have a website, thoughtsfromapage.com, and everything is there. It took me a really long time to find that kind of one holding place where everything would be, because I do have so many different ways I do things. I also have a blog on my site where I highlight other books that I really like. I write blogs for other people. So my website has it all together.
And what is any advice that you would have for podcasters?
Do a lot of research, take your time getting ready to launch, and then just enjoy it and realize that it is going to take a lot of time.
What would you say is your vision now for Thoughts from a Page?
I'm always focused on growth. I would really like the show to continue to grow, find new readers, engage with other people who enjoy it as much as I do. I have a Patreon community, which is growing strong, and I would love to continue to grow that. And also just continue to find new listeners and engage with people who like to read.
Well, Cindy, thank you so much for opening up your show and all your inspirations and how you do your podcasting for Thoughts from a Page. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. This was really fun.
And for those of you listening or watching, you can find Thoughts from a Page on Apple, Spotify, Google, wherever you get your podcast. And Evergreen Podcasts continues to bring you inspiring stories through branded content, original shows, and partner podcasts. Thank you for watching and helping us to grow.